Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun was just rising over the sleepy town of Umiwife when the small convoy of cars pulled up in front of Papa Ejike's modest, but well-kept compound. Chinello stood by the doorway, smoothing the folds of her lilac lace wrapper, her heart fluttering as she watched her soon-to-be husband, Uchenna, step out of a black Toyota Camry. He cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile that seemed to melt away the tension in any room. Papa Ejike, her aging father, stood beside her, leaning slightly on his walking stick, a proud glint in his eyes. To him, this was not just his daughter's wedding introduction. It was the crowning moment of years of careful guidance, sacrifices, and quiet prayers. When Uchenna greeted him with a respectful bow, Papa Ejike felt his heart swell. "A good man," he whispered to himself. Chinello's eyes lingered on Uchenna's face, drinking in the kindness she thought she saw there. Back then, there were no shadows of arrogance, no flicker of the pride that would later consume him. There was only the man who made her laugh over bowls of steaming Yokota at Mama Chinyer's roadside joint, the man who had promised her a home filled with peace and love. The wedding itself was simple but beautiful, a celebration that blended the warmth of family with the blessings of tradition. Neighbors gathered under a wide canopy, eating jollof rice, fried plantain, and peppered goat meat, while a live highlife band played love songs that made the old women sway in their seats. Uchenna and Chinello danced until their clothes clung to their skin, their laughter floating into the warm evening air. Papa Ejike, despite his modest means, had spared no effort to make the day special for his only child. He had called in favors, borrowed money discreetly, and even sold his prized vintage radio to cover the last bill. "A man's joy," he had said to his old friend, "is to see his daughter settled with a man who will protect her when he is gone." Chinello noticed the way her father's hands trembled slightly as he handed her over to Uchenna, but she brushed it off as a sign of emotion, not knowing that in the years to come, those same hands would reach out to steady her after her world collapsed. The early months of marriage were everything she had dreamed of. Uchenna was attentive, often returning home with roasted corn wrapped in brown paper or small tubs of ice cream when the days were particularly hot. They would sit together on their small balcony, their legs touching, sharing plans for the future. He spoke of building a bigger house, traveling abroad for holidays, and sending their children to the best schools. Chinello would lean against him, listening quietly, her heart swelling with hope. At night, she would kneel beside their bed, thanking God for the man she had married and for the peace in her father's eyes. There were no warning signs yet, no cracks in the foundation, only the comfort of a home where love seemed to grow naturally, like the hibiscus flowers Papa Ejike tended in the corner of his compound. It was a time of soft mornings, shared laughter, and the quiet certainty that they were building something lasting. Or so Chinello thought. The job offer came just 2 months after their wedding, and it felt like divine timing. Papa Ejike had been quietly working behind the scenes, speaking to an old colleague who now held a senior position at a large logistics company in the city. He believed that Uchenna, young and energetic, would be perfect for the operations supervisor role, a job that came with a comfortable salary, benefits, and the possibility of quick promotions. When he shared the news with Uchenna, the young man's eyes lit up, and he clasped his father-in-law's hands in gratitude. "Papa, I don't know how to thank you," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. That night, Chinello cooked a celebratory meal of agouti soup and pounded yam, and the three of them ate together, laughing and making plans. In those moments, the bond between Papa Ejike and his son-in-law seemed unshakable. But gratitude has a strange way of fading when pride takes root. A few months into the job, Uchenna's demeanor began to shift. He walked differently, spoke differently, and carried himself with a new air of self-importance. At first, Chinello thought it was just the natural confidence that came from professional success. But soon, she noticed a subtle but sharp change, the way he spoke about carrying the family, the way he would sigh whenever her father visited, as though the older man's presence was somehow a burden. One evening, as they sat on the balcony, Chinello reminded him to call her father and thank him again for helping secure the job. Uchenna's lips curled slightly as he replied, "I think I've shown enough appreciation. I'm the one doing the work now, not him." His words landed like a cold stone in her chest. She didn't argue. She only nodded and looked away, choosing to believe it was just a passing mood. The change in Uchenna's attitude was not lost on Papa Ijike either. On his occasional visits, he noticed how his son-in-law avoided eye contact, how conversations were cut short, and how his warm greetings had been replaced with polite formality. Papa Ijike, a man of dignity, chose not to confront him. Instead, he poured his energy into encouraging Chinello to keep her own dreams alive. "A woman should have something that is hers," he would say, helping her map out ideas for expanding her small tailoring business. Chinello, still deeply in love with her husband, dismissed her father's concerns. She believed Uchenna's distance was due to the stress of his new role, not realizing that a seed of arrogance had been planted, a seed that would soon grow into something far more poisonous. Ifunanya had been part of Chinello's life for as long as she could remember. They'd met in secondary school, shared secrets about crushes, studied together, and even worked side by side at a small fashion shop during their youth. When Chinello got married, Ifunanya was one of her bridesmaids, dancing with exaggerated joy as though the celebration were her own. So when she began visiting regularly after the wedding, Chinello welcomed her with open arms. She believed in the warmth of sisterhood, in the safety of shared history. Ifunanya would drop by in the afternoons, sometimes bringing pastries, sometimes just showing up unannounced, claiming she happened to be in the area. They would sit in the living room, chatting about business ideas and fashion trends, while Uchenna occasionally joined in, laughing at Ifunanya's sharp jokes. At first, Chinello thought nothing of it, but over time, there were small moments that unsettled her. The way Ifunanya's eyes lingered on Uchenna when he spoke. The way her laughter seemed just a little too loud at his jokes. The way she would compliment his shirts or cologne with a playful smile. Chinello tried to dismiss the unease as paranoia. After all, this was her friend. Ifunanya would often make subtle remarks comparing her own ambitions to Chinello's simple life. "You're lucky you have Uchenna to take care of you," she once said with a smirk. "Me, I can't imagine not chasing big things for myself." Uchenna chuckled at the comment, but Chinello felt a quiet sting. It was as though her life, once a source of pride, was being reduced to a footnote in her own home. The visits became more frequent, and Chinello began to notice that Ifunanya often came when she wasn't home. Neighbors mentioned seeing her at the house in the late afternoons, while Chinello was out meeting clients. One evening, she returned early to find Ifunanya and Uchenna sitting unusually close on the couch, their conversation dropping abruptly as she walked in. They smiled and acted normal, but something in the air had shifted. That night, as she lay beside her husband, Chinello stared at the ceiling, her mind wrestling with a question she didn't want to ask herself. Could her oldest friend betray her? She pushed the thought away, unwilling to believe the answer. It was easier for now to wrap herself in the illusion that her marriage and friendships were safe. But deep down, the first cracks in her certainty had already begun to form. The first cracks did not sound like thunder. They arrived as small, ordinary sounds that nobody else would notice. Uchenna started taking late meetings that stretched past midnight, returning with the faint scent of expensive perfume that was not his wife's. When Chinello asked gentle questions, he called them interrogations, rolling his eyes as if her concern were a childish habit he had indulged for too long. He began correcting the way she spoke to waiters, the way she folded towels, even the way she greeted him at the door, as though love were a script she kept forgetting. On Sundays, he stopped sitting close to her in church. Instead, he sat at the aisle, phone in hand, darting outside to answer calls that always couldn't wait. Papa Ijike visited and found his daughter bustling in the kitchen, while Uchenna lounged in the sitting room, television loud, laughter louder, attention elsewhere. When the old man suggested a quiet family meal, Uchenna agreed with an exaggerated smile that never reached his eyes, then left before dessert because the office had called. That evening, Papa Ijike asked his daughter if she was fine. Chinello smiled the way daughters do when their fathers carry too much already and said, "Yes, Papa. He's just stressed." She said it again to herself in the bathroom mirror that night, tracing her reflection with her eyes, training her heart to believe the small ache in her chest was only fatigue. Money, though there was enough of it, grew sharp edges and cut them in places love should have made soft. Uchenna started to complain about unnecessary expenses, frowning when Chinello bought new thread or fabric for her customers, insisting she submit a weekly house budget for approval. It was not the tracking that stung. It was the tone, the way he spoke to her like a subordinate. He commented that her business was cute, but not serious, that if she truly wanted to help she should leave the sewing and learn strategy, a phrase that sounded like care but tasted like disdain. He began to praise other women in front of her, co-workers who understood ambition, women who knew how to speak the language of success. When Chinello's hands shook as she hemmed a client's dress, she told herself it was the caffeine. But at night, lying beside the man who once whispered futures into her hair, she stayed awake listening for a sentence that did not come. "I'm proud of you." Ifunanya's visits continued, always bright, always a little too perfectly timed. The afternoons when Chinello had deliveries, the evenings when Uchenna claimed he needed fresh air. The neighbor's little girl mentioned one day that Auntie Ife had brought ice cream for Uncle Uche when Auntie Cello was out. The child said it with innocent delight. Chinello received it with a smile that hid a sudden, breathless quiet. Still, there were good days, and Chinello clung to them as proof that the tremors were temporary. They laughed over a comedy show and shared roasted yam in the corridor when the power went out. They visited her father and played Ludo till sunset, Uchenna teasing that the old man cheated, Papa pretending to be offended, everyone laughing until a lazy evening felt holy. On such days, the shadows seemed like tricks of the light. Chinello told herself that every marriage had seasons, that patience was the pathway back to warmth. She wore her wedding ring like a prayer and added new services to her shop: repairs, custom fittings, small classes for girls who wanted to learn the craft. She showed Uchenna the flyers, hopeful. He skimmed them and said, "Nice," then asked if she had ironed his blue shirt for a dinner he hadn't mentioned. She ironed it carefully, her eyes stinging with smoke from the faulty socket, and watched him leave without a kiss. After he went, she turned off the iron, leaned against the wall, and listened to the house echo. Somewhere inside that quiet, a conviction began to form. Not yet a decision, not yet a plan, just a clear-sounding bell. Love was changing shape, and she would need a different kind of strength to hold what remained. It happened at a cousin's Thanksgiving, music loud, the smell of pepper soup and suya fat drifting through the air, children darting between chairs, while aunties compared gelly sizes like trophies. Chinello wore a muted gold wrapper, because her father had said it brought out the brightness in her eyes. Uchenna arrived later than promised, brushing off apologies as he slid into the seat beside her. Phone already buzzing. When the MC called families forward to greet the celebrants, they went together, palms clapping to the rhythm of the High Life band. Back at the table, an uncle asked Uchenna, half joking, whether marriage had softened him. He laughed and said marriage had sharpened him, that he worked even harder now, because some families need carrying. The table chuckled, uncertain. What might have drifted away as clumsy humor turned heavy when he added, eyes on his drink, if I didn't step up, some people here would still be living from hand to mouth. The laughter vanished, like a light switched off. Papa Ajike looked up slowly, a question forming on his face, but Uchenna kept talking. Easier now that silence had surrendered. He said words like responsibility and dead weight, spoke of expectations others placed on him, and, though he did not name anyone, his gaze slid and settled, just for a heartbeat, on the old man whose favor had opened his first door. The moment stretched. Chinello felt the room tilt. She reached under the table for her father's hand and found it steady, warm. "Uche," she said softly. But her husband was a man on a platform now, voice lifted, story flowing. An ant cleared her throat, an elder muttered hyen under his breath. The MC's jokes grew forced. An embarrassment colored the evening like red dust. Someone tried to change the subject. Uchenna, sensing the shift, laughed, and said he was only being honest, the way successful people were often misunderstood. Papa Ijike rose slowly, thanked the host, and excused himself to the corridor for air. Chinello followed, teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. Outside, behind the hall, her father leaned on the railing, eyes on the orange smear of sunset. "Papa," she began, but he shook his head with a gentle dignity that made her throat close. "My daughter," he said, "a man who forgets where rain met him will one day forget where sun dried him. I am fine." He wasn't. Neither was she. Inside, the music stumbled back to life. When they returned to the table, Uchenna had stepped out to answer a call. He returned smiling, kissed Chinello's forehead as if nothing had happened, and asked if there was still pepper soup left. That night at home, words were made of flint. Chinello asked him why, and he replied that truth makes people uncomfortable. She said he had shamed her father. He said her father should be grateful he had turned out well. She reminded him, quietly, firmly, of the door her father had opened, the recommendation he had written, the trust he had extended. Uchenna said the job had been only an opportunity, that he alone had made it valuable. Then he switched off the light, rolled over, and slept with the easy conscience of a man who believed he was right. In the darkness, Chinello pressed her palm to her mouth to quiet a sound she did not recognize as her own. In the morning, she cooked for her father and delivered a tray before he woke, leaving a note that said, "Your daughter is proud to be your daughter." Later, at the shop, she hemmed a bride's gown with such precision that the seam looked like a new beginning. But when she paused to rest her eyes, the night replayed in her mind, and she felt something in her unclasp, a curtain pulled back, a picture lit by unwanted light. Pride, she realized, was not just a habit. It was a governor in Uchenna's heart, turning the volume up on himself and down on everyone else. And pride, when fed, always asked for more. It rained the afternoon, he told her. Not a hard rain that hammers roofs into submission, but a measured fall that makes the world hold its breath. The kind of rain that remembers farmers and nurses old mango trees back to green. Chinello had just placed a pot of beans on low heat when she heard the car horn, 2 short notes, impatient. She wiped her hands and hurried to the gate. Uchenna stood by the car, door open, engine running, as if the conversation he had come to have already needed an exit. He did not come inside. He did not greet her father, who was in the parlor reading a devotional. He leaned on the car and said, as one states the weather, "This is not working." Rain spattered his shoulders in faint dark crescents. His phone lit up in his hand. Chinello swallowed. "What is not working?" she asked, though some part of her, older than marriage, older than hope, knew the script that followed. He said marriage. He said dreams. He said misalignment, like a manager closing a file. He said she lacked ambition, that he needed a partner who matched his speed, that no hard feelings. She felt her mouth open and close, the way a fish tries to drink air. She looked past him and saw a shape in the passenger seat. Ifyinanya, face half-turned, a scarf tied around her hair, eyes averted as if modesty could disguise betrayal. For a fragment of a second, the world shrank to a pinhole. The scarf, the flutter of Ifyinanya's lashes, the soft glow of a dashboard screen running a shared playlist Chinello had once made for quiet nights. "So," Chinello said, surprising herself with how calm she sounded, "you are leaving your wife for my friend." Uchenna shifted, a flash of irritation crossing his features at the word wife. As if the title were a hook, he had to yank free. He said he had found someone who believed in him, someone who understood the lifestyle. The rain thickened, beating on his lashes. From the doorway, Papa Ijike's voice called, "Nello." Chinello did not turn. "Go inside, Papa," she said softly. To Uchenna, she asked, "What do I tell my father?" He shrugged, that small, deadly gesture that says, "Your pain is furniture in my new room." "Tell him the truth," he said. "Tell him I'm done." Ifyinanya's window slid down an inch. "Chinello, she began, but Chinello raised a hand. "Not today. Not this way." There were no plates thrown, no knees sunk to the ground. Chinello stood under the small, stubborn rain and chose dignity because it was the only thing he had not taken. She did not beg. She did not bargain. She asked for her house keys back, and he returned them with a sigh that suggested inconvenience. He said he would sort out the papers and send what belonged to her. He used that word twice, belonged, as if ownership could be cleanly separated from memory. Then he got into the car. For a heartbeat, she met Ifeanyi's eyes. Something like pity flickered there, cheap and late. The car pulled away. The pot of beans burned. Inside, Papa Ejike rose slowly, as if learning again the weight of his years. In the growing dusk, the old man placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, steady and warm, the way he had when she was 5 and had fallen off a bicycle. "My child," he said, voice catching, "we will not die here." Chinello nodded, though her throat was thick with smoke and rain and all the words she would not be allowed to say tonight. She turned off the stove, opened the windows, and let the living room breathe. Somewhere outside, thunder spoke a sentence it had been rehearsing. Somewhere inside, a future she had not planned began, quiet and unafraid of being small. The weeks after Uchenna's departure became a cruel parade of public reminders. It was not just that he had left her, it was how he left, and with whom. Ifeanyi, the woman who once wore matching geli with her at weddings, now walked proudly beside him in photographs posted online. They were in restaurants Chinello and Uchenna had once saved months to afford, in lounges where a single drink cost half her week's grocery bill, in hotels she had only ever admired from a passing bus. Ifeanyi's captions stung more than the images. "My king, my everything," or "Some connections are just destiny." Comments rolled in, some congratulatory, some laced with gossip, many tagging people who tagged more people. Even those who loved Chinello hesitated to reach out, unsure whether a message would comfort or reopen the wound. In the market, women whispered as she passed, their eyes flicking from her face to her bare ring finger. At church, the usher who once smiled warmly now offered polite nods, her voice lowering when others approached. The shame was not hers to carry, yet it clung like the smell of rain on damp fabric, stubborn and impossible to wash away in a single rinse. At home, the silence became heavy in ways she had not known silence could be. The television, once a background hum of football matches or sitcoms, now sat dark most evenings. She avoided the radio because love songs felt like knives and news bulletins sometimes mentioned the social events where Uchenna and Ifeanyi's name surfaced. Papa Ejike, though he never spoke a harsh word about his son-in-law, grew quieter too. He moved about the house like a man measuring his steps, unwilling to disturb the fragile balance in his daughter's eyes. But Chinello knew he heard the same whispers. An old man's friends were not immune to gossip, and pity traveled fast. The few customers who still brought her tailoring work did so in hushed voices, as though her life were a fragile porcelain they feared to drop. She smiled when they came, thanked them for their loyalty, and sewed with precision as if every stitch could mend more than cloth. But when they left, the air felt thinner, and she would stand at the doorway watching the road until her vision blurred, unsure whether from the afternoon sun or the weight pressing on her chest. There were small betrayals she discovered slowly, like thorns hidden in fabric. One of her regular suppliers stopped taking her calls. She later learned Uchenna had shifted his business to a competitor, claiming she was no longer relevant. The woman who had rented her the shop space dropped by one afternoon, and, in a tone too sweet to be sincere, asked if she was managing without distractions. Chinello understood then how deep the story had traveled. Even the neighbors' children, once quick to greet her, now hesitated at the gate, perhaps warned by parents not to linger too long. In this shrinking circle of comfort, Chinello began to wake earlier than usual, not because she had more work, but because morning light felt like a safe place to breathe before the world's eyes turned toward her again. She rose before the cocks crowed, swept the compound, and cooked for her father in silence, her movements deliberate, steady, building a rhythm that might one day outlast the humiliation that now shadowed her every step. When the last of her savings disappeared, it did so quietly, without ceremony. A final rent payment for her shop, a bulk purchase of fabric she hoped would yield enough orders to keep her afloat, and then nothing. The small stack of folded naira notes she once kept hidden under her clothes in a drawer was gone. She tried to calculate how she had arrived here, but the math was a cruel reminder. The divorce, though not yet formalized on paper, had already stripped her of Uchenna's financial support. The customers lost in the gossip storm were not returning. Her shop lease expired, and the landlord, kind but not sentimental, politely declined to extend it without full payment up front. She packed her sewing machine into a borrowed truck and returned to her father's house, the machine sitting like a mute companion in the corner of the living room. The transition from her own small home to her childhood bedroom was harder than she had imagined. The walls, painted in faded pastel years ago, seemed to press closer around her each night. She could no longer cook whatever she wanted whenever she wanted. Papa Ajike had modest means, and their meals were planned with care. Trips to the market became exercises in restraint, and each fabric she bought for a client was measured twice before cutting, because mistakes now cost more than just money. Yet, amid the hardship, her father's presence was a quiet balm. He never asked for explanations, never pressed for details she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he told her stories from his youth, of times when he too had been cornered by life, and had found unexpected ways forward. His faith in her was steady, and it wrapped around her like a thin but enduring blanket in the cold nights when sleep would not come. Still, there were moments when the weight of loss felt unbearable. Seeing her wedding gown, carefully packed away in a box under the bed, triggered tears she thought had dried. Passing the restaurant where she and Uchenna had shared their first anniversary dinner felt like walking barefoot over shards of glass. And sometimes in the stillness of early morning, she would catch herself imagining his car pulling up to the gate, him walking in with that boyish grin, apologizing for everything. She would imagine it just long enough to feel the warmth of it, then tear it away like cloth from a wound, reminding herself that some returns were worse than departures. Slowly, she began to accept that the life she had built was gone, and if she wanted another, she would have to build it from the ashes. It was Papa Ajike who first suggested she tell her story. Not the version weighted with names and sharp details, but the simple truth of her situation. A woman starting over, eager to work, willing to learn. At first, Chinello resisted. She had been raised to guard her private life, to carry burdens without turning them into public performances. But hunger, she learned, was a great persuader, and not just the hunger of the body. She was hungry for a chance, for a door to open that she could walk through on her own strength. One evening, with her father watching quietly from his armchair, she took out her phone and began typing. The words came slowly at first, then faster, the story pouring out like water, finally finding an unblocked channel. She wrote about her skills as a tailor, about her willingness to take any honest work, about wanting to support her father without relying on charity. She avoided bitterness, kept her sentences clean of accusation, and instead spoke of hope as if it were something tangible she could hold. She posted it on her small Facebook page and slept without expecting much. By morning, her notifications had multiplied beyond anything she had ever seen. Friends had shared it, strangers had commented encouragement, and people she had never met were offering small donations. Some sent kind messages privately, telling her they had been through similar trials and that starting over was possible. Others offered job leads, clerical work, customer service, even opportunities in distant cities. But the most surprising message came from a woman who owned a mid-sized fashion business in Lagos. She had seen the post through a mutual contact and was moved by Chinello's dignity in the face of loss. She offered to send some fabrics and a small grant to help Chinello restart her sewing business. Chinello read the message twice, her hands trembling, unsure whether to cry or laugh. By the end of the week, parcels began arriving. Rolls of ankara, spools of thread, and a note from the businesswoman that read, "Your story is your strength. Don't let anyone take it from you." Chinello set up her sewing machine in the corner of her father's living room and began again, the rhythmic hum of the needle replacing the silence that had settled there. She took on small jobs first, alterations, simple blouses, charging just enough to cover costs and save a little. Each satisfied client became another small light in the dim corridor of her rebuilding. The viral post had not just brought her help, it had brought her back into the world, reminding her that her worth was not defined by the man who left, but by the hands that could still create something beautiful from the fabric life handed her. The fabrics from the Lagos businesswoman were more than just materials. They were the physical proof that her story mattered, that she was not invisible. Chinello approached them with reverence, unfolding each Ankara print carefully, smoothing out the creases, as if coaxing them to remember their purpose. She began with small projects, simple blouses, children's dresses, and alteration jobs for neighbors who had quietly returned to her after seeing her online resurgence. She refused to take shortcuts. Every seam was neat, every hem pressed to perfection. Word began to spread, not through pity this time, but through the satisfied whispers of customers. "She's good," they would say in the market. "Her stitches hold." The steady trickle of orders was not enough to make her rich, but it was enough to keep her working from sunrise till late evening, her sewing machine filling the house with its rhythmic hum. Papa Ejike became her unofficial assistant, not in the sense of sewing, but in managing the flow of clients. He greeted each customer warmly, making tea or groundnut snacks while they waited, telling stories that made people linger longer than they planned. He also insisted on recording every income and expense, teaching Chinello the discipline of tracking her business growth. "Every naira must know where it is going," he would say, tapping his pen against the notebook. At first, she humored him, but soon she saw the wisdom in his approach. She began setting aside a small portion of every earning, even when the temptation to use it was strong. That small envelope of savings became a source of quiet pride, a symbol that she was no longer living from hand to mouth. The more she worked, the more her dreams began to stretch beyond survival. She started sketching designs late at night, ideas that combined traditional Nigerian fabrics with modern cuts she had seen in magazines. She imagined creating her own clothing line one day, not just sewing for others, but building a brand that carried her name. The thought scared her, but it also made her pulse quicken in a way she had not felt since before the divorce. She didn't tell her father yet. Some dreams needed time to grow in private before they could face the world. For now, she focused on the next customer, the next dress, the next chance to prove to herself that she could stand without the shadow of Uchenna over her life. The woman she was becoming still carried scars, but she also carried scissors sharp enough to cut a new pattern for her future. News of Uchenna and Ifunanya's wedding reached her the way unwanted news often does, in layers. First, a neighbor mentioned seeing them at a boutique, shopping for matching outfits. Then, a mutual acquaintance posted a photo from a bridal shower, where Ifunanya's laughter rang out in frozen pixels. Finally, the official wedding pictures flooded social media. A sprawling event at a luxury hotel, with floral arches and a champagne fountain. The kind of wedding Chinello and Uchenna had once dreamed of but never afforded. Ifunanya wore a gown that sparkled under the lights, her head tilted toward Uchenna in a pose designed to whisper intimacy. The captions were deliberate, tagged with lines like, "When you find your true partner," and "Some stories have happy endings after all." Chinello scrolled through them with a steady face, her thumb pausing only briefly on one picture where Uchenna smiled in a way that once belonged to her. The parade of public spectacle did not end with the photos. Within weeks, the couple moved into a larger house in the city, its white walls and modern furniture showcased in Ifunanya's Instagram stories. She flaunted their dinners at upscale restaurants, their weekend getaways to resorts, and the expensive gifts Uchenna showered her with: designer handbags, gold jewelry, imported perfumes. To the world, they were the picture of prosperity. To Chinello, they were the predictable continuation of a story she no longer wanted to be part of. She had seen enough to know that Uchenna's need to be admired was being fed, perhaps even more hungrily, by his new wife. She noticed, though, that in some photos, his smile seemed just a little tight, the lines around his eyes deeper than before. In her quiet moments, Chinello did not envy them. What she felt was closer to relief, a soft loosening in her chest, knowing she no longer had to perform the role of the supportive wife to a man whose pride outgrew his gratitude. Ifunanya could have that role now, along with the demands it carried. Chinello had a business to grow, a father to care for, and a life to rebuild on her own terms. She filed the wedding away in her mind as another chapter that belonged to someone else, one she would never reread. And yet, in the stillness of the night, she sometimes wondered, without bitterness, how long such a parade could last before the costumes tore and the music faded. Behind the carefully curated images of love and luxury, the cracks began to form faster than Uchenna could plaster them over. Ifyinanya, freed from the need to charm him into marriage, revealed a sharper edge to her personality. She began managing the household finances with a firm, controlling grip, insisting on approving every expense, even those related to his work. At first, Uchenna brushed it off as her being organized, but soon it became clear that she was directing more money toward her personal indulgences than toward the stability of their home. Shopping sprees became routine, often followed by lavish brunches with her friends, where she would complain loudly about how exhausting it was to manage everything, while Uchenna focused on his own world. She also developed a habit of belittling his ideas in public. At dinners with business associates, she would interrupt his stories with corrections or laugh at his old-fashioned approach to certain deals. Uchenna, who had once thrived on being the center of admiration, began to feel undermined in subtle but cutting ways. Worse still, Ifyinanya had little interest in the quiet domestic gestures that once made Chinello's presence feel like home. Meals were often ordered in, the house left to hired cleaners, and evenings spent apart as she claimed she needed space to recharge. Uchenna found himself eating alone more often, the silence of their new home echoing louder than he liked to admit. Yet, pride kept him from acknowledging these cracks to anyone. To the outside world, he doubled down on the illusion, posting more pictures, buying bigger gifts, and planning extravagant outings. But the strain showed in small, telling ways. The dark circles under his eyes, the shorter temper with his staff, the long pauses before answering questions about his personal life. He noticed, too, that Ifyinanya's phone was often face down on the table when she was with him, and her smile when she texted someone else had a softness he hadn't seen directed at him in months. The honeymoon phase, so loudly announced to the world, was already thinning to a whisper. But admitting that would mean admitting he had traded something real for something shiny, and Uchenna was not yet ready to face the man in the mirror who had made that choice. The first time Chinello realized her work had begun to reach beyond her neighborhood was on a Wednesday afternoon, when a stranger knocked on her father's gate carrying a neatly folded Ankara dress. The woman had traveled from 2 towns away after seeing a picture of Chinello's work on a friend's Facebook post. She wanted alterations, but more importantly, she wanted to meet the tailor whose stitches looked like they were drawn with a ruler. That encounter lit a small fire of confidence in Chinello. Soon, customers began to arrive not just for mending, but for original designs, wedding guest dresses, matching outfits for couples, and uniforms for church choirs. She worked late into the night, her fingers sore, but her heart steady, knowing that each finished piece was another brick in the foundation of her independence. Papa Ejike watched his daughter's transformation with a quiet pride. He saw how she greeted customers warmly, how she listened carefully to their requests, and how she adjusted her designs to make them feel heard. She had begun to take notes on fabric quality, keeping a record of which suppliers were reliable and which were not, ensuring that every delivery was on time. In the evenings, she would count her earnings at the dining table, sliding a portion into a small envelope marked savings and another into expansion. "One day, Papa," she would say, "I'll open a proper shop, one with glass doors and a signboard with my name." He would nod, imagining the day when people in the city would pass her store and say, "That's Chinello's place. She's the best." Her rise was not without challenges. There were weeks when orders were fewer and the temptation to lower her prices loomed. But Chinello had learned that value could not be built on desperation. Instead of cutting her rates, she doubled her effort in quality, ensuring that every piece leaving her table carried her signature neatness. Her loyal customers became her ambassadors, bringing in friends and family. By the end of the year, she had saved enough to rent a small but visible shop space in a busier part of town. On the day she moved in, she stood in the doorway, running her hand over the frame as though blessing it. This was no longer survival. It was the beginning of a life she could shape with her own hands, a life no one could snatch away again. While Chinello's life gathered quiet momentum, Uchenna's world was shifting in ways he did not yet fully grasp. The investments Ifeananya had pushed him toward, a luxury lounge in the city, a boutique imported goods store, and a crypto venture run by one of her friends, were all bleeding money. The boutique was losing customers to cheaper competitors, the lounge's rent was draining profits faster than patrons could spend, and the crypto scheme had begun to show signs of being a scam. Uchenna, still determined to maintain appearances, poured more money in, hoping to buy time, until things turned around. But each deposit felt like tossing buckets of water into a sinking boat. Ifeanyanya's behavior was changing too. She began disappearing for long stretches, citing business trips that left vague details and even vaguer returns. She came back with expensive handbags and perfumes, but no receipts, no explanations. When Uchenna asked, she brushed him off with a laugh, saying he worried too much. She no longer waited up for him when he worked late, and their dinners, once posted proudly online, became rare, replaced by solitary meals eaten over paperwork or reheated takeout. The house, though large and lavish, began to feel empty, its glossy surfaces reflecting back the truth he didn't want to face. They were living separate lives under the same roof. There were whispers too, friends hinting that they'd seen Ifeananya in places she shouldn't have been, with company she shouldn't have kept. Uchenna dismissed them, unwilling to admit the possibility of betrayal. Pride, that old armor, told him to hold his head high and keep the facade intact. But late at night, when the house was silent and the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner, doubt would creep in like a slow leak. He found himself scrolling through their old pictures, comparing the warmth in her eyes then to the practiced smile she wore now. The man who had once stood on a stage of self-assurance was beginning to sense that the floor beneath him was not as solid as he believed. The shift from partner to opponent was so subtle at first that Uchenna almost missed it. It began with Ifeananya taking a more active role in managing their assets, as she called it. She insisted on handling property documents for safekeeping, arguing that it would free Uchenna to focus on business. He agreed, relieved to delegate the paperwork he found tedious. She was meticulous, almost too meticulous, about signatures and transfers, often insisting they visit the lawyer's office together. He signed wherever she pointed, trusting that her ambition matched his interests. In truth, she was quietly transferring ownership of key properties into her name, 2 rental houses, the boutique space, and even their marital home. By the time Uchenna noticed something was off, the trap had already been sprung. It happened when he tried to refinance one of the rental houses to cover a business debt, only to be told that the deed listed Ifeananya as the sole owner. His initial reaction was disbelief, then anger, then a sharp, creeping fear. When he confronted her, she didn't deny it. Instead, she accused him of being careless with their finances and claimed she was protecting their future from his poor decisions. The argument escalated into a shouting match, with both hurling accusations that had been simmering for months. Within weeks, Ifeananya made her move. She filed for divorce, citing emotional neglect and financial irresponsibility, a cruel inversion of the truth. Armed with the property deeds and a skilled lawyer, she left him with almost nothing but his clothes, his car, and a mountain of debts. In court, she sat poised and elegant, as though the entire performance were an act she had been rehearsing for years. Uchenna, stripped of his assets and his pride, walked out of a courtroom into a world that no longer bent for him. The woman he had chosen over Chinello, the friend he had flaunted to humiliate his wife, had outplayed him entirely. It was the first time in years that Uchenna truly understood the meaning of loss, and it was only the beginning. The court's final verdict was read in a voice so calm it almost felt cruel. The judge, flipping through the pages of the file, confirmed that all documentation clearly showed Ifeananya as the rightful owner of the contested properties. There were no loopholes, no errors in the transfer process, no chance for Uchenna to claw back what he had signed away. The 2 rental houses, the boutique, even their marital home, all gone in the space of a few words. Uchenna's lawyer tried to argue undue influence, claiming that Ifeananya had manipulated her way into acquiring the assets, but the judge was unmoved. "The court does not protect those who sign away their rights willingly," she said, tapping her pen against the bench. Uchenna's stomach nodded. The word struck him not just as a legal defeat, but as a mirror reflecting every arrogant decision he had made. He had trusted the wrong person, dismissed the right one, and now the cost was undeniable. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Ifeanyi stepped into a waiting SUV, her outfit impeccable, makeup flawless, a picture of composure. She offered no comment, just a polite smile that only deepened Uchenna's humiliation. The cameras turned to him, capturing the haggardness in his face, the slump of his shoulders. Gone was the man who had once strutted into gatherings, with an expensive watch catching the light and his arm around a beautiful woman. Now he was a man avoiding questions, mumbling no comment as he pushed through the crowd. Every flash of the camera felt like a jab, each shouted inquiry a reminder of how far he had fallen. When he returned to the small apartment he had rented after the separation, the silence greeted him like an unwelcome host. The rooms felt too big for one man, yet too empty to provide comfort. Bills lay unopened on the table. The fridge held little more than bottled water and leftover takeout. His phone buzzed with messages, not from friends offering support, but from creditors demanding payment and relatives pretending concern while hinting at financial assistance for themselves. He poured himself a drink, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall. The realization settled over him slowly, like a shadow creeping across a room. The woman he had built his second life around had dismantled it with precision, and he had handed her the tools himself. Just when Uchenna thought the worst had passed, another blow landed, one he hadn't even seen coming. A thick envelope arrived by courier, stamped with the court's insignia. Inside was a notice of proceedings for child support, filed by none other than Ifeanyi. The claim stated that Uchenna was legally responsible for the upkeep of her son, whom he had signed as father on the birth certificate during their marriage. He remembered the day vividly, how she had placed the document before him in the hospital, smiling warmly as she said, "Sign here, my love. It's for the records." At the time, he hadn't questioned it. After all, they were married. Now, reading the claim, he felt the floor tilt beneath him. The notice demanded not only monthly payments, but also backdated support for years since the child's birth. His lawyer explained grimly that the law recognized the man listed on the birth certificate as the legal father, regardless of biology. Uchenna tried to protest, insisting the child wasn't his, but without a prior DNA test or legal contest during the marriage. His arguments were nothing but air. The figure stated in the order was staggering, an amount that would have been manageable during his peak years, but was now impossible given his drained accounts and mounting debts. The hearing was swift and brutal. Ifeanyi arrived with her lawyer, poised as ever, her demeanor one of calm entitlement. She spoke of the child's needs, his education, his right to the same quality of life he had known before the divorce. Uchenna, his voice tight with suppressed anger, tried to argue his financial incapacity, but the court was unmoved. The ruling came down in her favor, solidifying the payment schedule and warning of severe penalties for default. As they left the courtroom, Ifeanyi passed him without a glance, her perfume lingering in the air like an insult. Outside, Uchenna stood on the courthouse steps, papers in hand, the weight of the debt settling over him like chains. This was no longer just about losing property or pride. It was about being tethered to the very person who had dismantled him, forced to fund her life long after she had walked away. The weeks that followed were a slow, grinding descent. With most of his income streams gone and his savings depleted, Uchenna began liquidating what little he had left, selling his car, pawning his watches, and quietly letting go of the last remnants of his old life. Friends who had once called him for favors stopped answering his messages. Business contacts avoided his calls, not wanting to be associated with a man whose name now carried the stench of public failure. Even family members kept their distance, wary that any conversation might end in a request for money. He became a ghost in the circles where he had once been a centerpiece. Each month, the child support payments loomed like an execution date. He scrambled to meet the first deadline, borrowing from a former colleague who made it clear the favor would not be repeated. By the second month, he was behind, the arrears piling up with interest. Letters from the court arrived weekly, each one a louder threat of enforcement measures, asset seizures, wage garnishments, even jail time. Uchenna began avoiding his own mailbox, letting the envelopes stack in the corner like an accusation he couldn't face. Nights were the worst. The stillness pressed in, and every creak of the apartment reminded him that he was alone, not just in space, but in reputation. In moments of clarity, he thought of Chinello, not with the old prideful dismissiveness, but with a sharp pang of regret. He remembered the mornings she rose early to iron his shirts, the evenings she stayed up to make his favorite stew after a long day, the quiet respect she showed his ambitions, even when they pulled him away from her. He had traded all that for the thrill of being adored by someone who saw him as a stepping stone. Now the stone had been stepped on, cracked, and left behind. Pride had kept him from admitting it sooner, but there was no denying it anymore. He had destroyed his own life, and the only person who had truly cared for him was the one he had humiliated most. And soon he would have to face her again, because the court's latest warning made it clear. Without immediate funds, prison was next. The day Uchenna decided to go to Chinello's shop, the sky was heavy with the promise of rain, a fitting backdrop for the humiliation that lay ahead. He had delayed it for days, convincing himself he could find another solution, another loan, another miracle. But each time he opened the latest court notice, the reality stared back at him. He was out of time. If the child support payment wasn't made by the end of the week, the next time he saw daylight might be through prison bars. He stood outside the shop for several minutes before entering, staring at the glass doors that bore her name in bold, elegant letters. Chinello's Creations. It was a name that had become respected in town, a sign of quality and reliability. He remembered scoffing at her little tailoring business years ago, calling it a cute hobby. Now, that same business was thriving, and he was about to ask its owner for help to save him from ruin. When he finally pushed open the door, the bell above it chimed, and the sound seemed to pull every pair of eyes toward him. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of new fabric and ironing starch. Rolls of brightly colored ankara lined the walls, and sewing machines hummed in the hands of skilled assistants. Chinello was at the far end, bent over a dress on a mannequin, pinning the fabric with practiced precision. She looked up at the sound of the bell, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of recognition and something else, something unreadable. The shop fell into a hush. Her staff, most of whom knew at least part of her story, exchanged glances but said nothing. Chinello straightened, set down her pins, and walked toward him with a calmness that made his throat dry. They sat in her small office at the back of the shop, the hum of work resuming outside. Uchenna stumbled through his explanation, how he had fallen behind on payments, how the court was threatening enforcement, how he needed a loan to get through the next few months. His voice cracked more than once, though he tried to keep it steady. He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the edge of her desk, tracing the grain of the wood with his fingers. Chinello listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, the silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "the day you told my father he was a leech?" Her words landed like a hammer. Uchenna closed his eyes, the memory flooding back in all its shameful clarity. Chinello did not raise her voice, but each word carried the weight of years. Years of endurance, humiliation, and quiet rebuilding. She told him plainly that she had no interest in revenge, but she also had no obligation to rescue him. Still, she was willing to help on one condition. He would publicly apologize to her father, acknowledging the insult he had dealt him and the help he had once received. Uchenna swallowed hard. The condition was worse than he had feared, not because the apology would cost him money, but because it would cost him the last scrap of pride he had been clinging to. Yet he knew he had no choice. Prison would crush him completely, and there was no one else left to turn to. With a reluctant nod, he agreed. 2 days later, he arrived at Papa Jike's house. The old man was seated on the veranda, a book in his lap. Chinello stood nearby, her arms folded. Uchenna approached slowly, each step heavier than the last. He began his apology haltingly, speaking of gratitude he had failed to show, of words spoken in arrogance, of mistakes he could never undo. Papa Ejike listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Uchenna finished, the old man simply nodded and said, "It is good to see a man admit when he is wrong. But understand, some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt." He turned back to his book, leaving Uchenna standing there with the knowledge that forgiveness was not the same as restoration. True to her word, Chinello gave him enough money to cover the immediate payment and avoid jail. It was not a gift, but a loan, and she made it clear she expected it repaid in full. Uchenna accepted with a bowed head, knowing he had been spared only the worst consequence, not the judgment of his own conscience. As he left, he glanced back once, and saw Chinello laughing softly at something her father had said. Her face lit with a peace he had never been able to give her. Walking away, he felt the hollowness inside him expand. He had lost the wealth, the properties, the status, but losing Chinello's respect and knowing she no longer needed anything from him was the wound that would never heal. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.